When people hear the words Tudor mansion, they often picture a world of carved oak, glittering banquets, velvet sleeves, and noble families strolling through bright galleries while musicians play in the background. From the outside, that image is not entirely false. A great Tudor house was meant to impress. It was meant to announce wealth, ancestry, loyalty to the crown, and control over land, servants, and resources. But daily life inside one of these houses was far less graceful than the polished fantasy suggests. A Tudor mansion was not simply a beautiful home. It was a machine of status, discipline, labor, religion, and display. It was crowded, smoky, expensive to maintain, and completely dependent on the work of dozens of people who would never enjoy the luxury they helped create. Between 1485 and 1603, England changed dramatically. The Tudor dynasty began with Henry VII after the Wars of the Roses and ended with Elizabeth I, under whom England became more stable, more ambitious, and more conscious of social rank than ever. The people who owned the great houses of this era did not build them just to live in comfort. They built them to be seen. Their homes were political statements in brick, stone, and timber. They were places where alliances were formed, guests were judged, servants were managed, marriages were negotiated, and family prestige was displayed room by room. The first thing a visitor would notice was the exterior. A Tudor mansion could dominate the landscape around it. Even before reaching the entrance, a traveler would pass through an approach designed to impress. Broad grounds, gatehouses, courtyards, gardens, stables, kitchens, barns, and outbuildings, all arranged to show scale and order. Tall chimneys signaled wealth because they suggested multiple hearths and private rooms. Large windows were another display of privilege. Glass was costly, and the more of it a family could afford, the more clearly they could advertise that they belonged near the top of society. Some houses still carried echoes of the medieval world, with moats, towers, and fortified features. But by the Tudor period, many elite residences were becoming less like castles and more like theatrical displays of status. Defense still mattered, but appearance mattered more. That did not mean comfort came easily. These houses were large, but size did not automatically make them pleasant. Great rooms could be drafty in winter and stale in summer. Smoke from fireplaces and candles clung to fabric, beams, and even hair. Corridors were darker than modern viewers usually imagine. Even with many windows, light was uneven. The deeper parts of the house often remained dim for most of the day. After sunset, life narrowed to the reach of candlelight and firelight. A mansion might look grand at noon, but feel shadowy and enclosed by evening. At the heart of the house stood the Great Hall. More than any other room, it embodied Tudor social order. This was where the household gathered, where meals were served, where visitors were received, and where news was shared. It was not just a dining space. It was a stage. Long tables stretched across the room, with benches arranged carefully according to rank. Tapestries hung on the walls, both for decoration and to provide some insulation against the cold. At one end stood a raised dais, where the most important members of the household sat at the high table. Their position made their status unmistakable. Lower-ranking relatives, officials, and guests sat farther down the hall. Servants either ate separately or at the far end, depending on the occasion. Even in moments of hospitality, strict order was always maintained. Every meal became a visible reminder of hierarchy. A great Tudor mansion was rarely occupied by just a small family. It was a household in the older sense of the word, a small, structured society centered around one elite family. Alongside the master, mistress, and children lived a wide range of people. Widowed relatives, wards, tutors, chaplains, stewards, ladies-in-waiting, secretaries, cooks, pages, laundry workers, stable hands, gardeners, nurses, and many others. Dozens of servants could live within the house, and on busy days even more people moved through its kitchens, courtyards, and service areas. Privacy, especially for those of lower rank, was extremely limited. A Tudor mansion had many doors, but few people had the power to truly close themselves away. The daily rhythm of the house began early. This was a world ruled by daylight, routine, and necessity. Long before the master or mistress rose, servants had already been awake for hours. Fires needed to be lit and maintained. Water had to be carried from wells or nearby sources. Floors were swept. Chamber pots were emptied. Bread was prepared, brewing was checked, animals were fed, clothes were brushed and laid out. Messages were delivered. In a modern home, comfort depends on hidden systems, heating, plumbing, electricity. In a Tudor mansion, comfort depended entirely on human effort. Every warm room, every clean garment, every prepared meal existed because someone had already worked hard to make it possible. At the center of this complex system stood the steward or another senior servant. Their role was essential. A great household required not just wealth but careful management. Supplies had to be purchased, stored, counted, and protected. Meat, grain, ale, wine, firewood, candles, wax, spices, and cloth all passed through systems of oversight. Nothing could be wasted. Theft or mismanagement could damage not only finances but reputation. Hospitality itself was a major expense. A wealthy family was expected to feed guests generously, maintain a large staff, and present a constant image of order and prosperity. A house that appeared impressive but was poorly run risked embarrassment. In Tudor society, disorder was more than an inconvenience. It was a sign of failure, even dishonor. The structure of the house itself reflected this strict organization. As one moved deeper into the mansion, spaces became more private and more prestigious. The Great Hall represented public life and authority. Beyond it lay more intimate areas, parlors, withdrawing rooms, and private chambers where the family could retreat from constant observation. Servants, meanwhile, moved through passageways, kitchens, storage rooms, pantries, and service stairs. These hidden routes allowed the household to function smoothly without interrupting the visible elegance of elite life. The building itself quietly taught everyone their place. Certain doors were meant for masters. Certain spaces belonged to guests. Other routes were reserved for servants carrying food, fuel, linen, and waste, always working just out of sight. Bedrooms in a Tudor mansion revealed as much about status as any public room. The finest chambers in the house could be impressive, even by modern standards. Large carved beds stood as symbols of wealth, surrounded by heavy curtains that provided a sense of warmth and privacy. These beds were layered with feather mattresses, fine linen sheets, embroidered hangings, and richly colored coverlets. But even the most luxurious bedroom was not as comfortable as it might appear. Drafts slipped through windows and gaps in the structure. Smoke from nearby fireplaces lingered in the air. Bedding could attract insects. Chamber pots were kept close at hand and used throughout the night. Servants or attendants often slept nearby, meaning true privacy was rare. The romantic image of peaceful aristocratic rest quickly fades when one considers how many people, smells, and practical inconveniences filled the same space. For lower-ranking members of the household, conditions were far less appealing. Many servants shared cramped rooms or slept in lofts, attics, or corners near their work areas. Comfort followed status, and so did warmth. The best rooms had the most protection from cold, while others endured harsh conditions, especially during damp English winters. Fireplaces offered some relief, but they consumed large amounts of fuel. Even in a wealthy household, heating such a vast space was a constant struggle. Clothing played an important role in both survival and social identity. Tudor dress clearly marked status. The elite wore layers of wool, linen, silk, velvet, and fur, often decorated with jewels and expensive dyes. These were not simply fashion choices, they were visible statements of rank. Sumptuary laws even regulated what different classes could wear, reinforcing the rigid social structure. In a mansion, it was often possible to recognize a person's status at a glance, simply by observing their clothing. At the same time, clothing served a practical purpose. Layers helped protect against the cold. Linen garments absorbed sweat and needed regular washing. Outer garments shielded against drafts. In many ways, survival and appearance were closely linked. Cleanliness was valued, but achieving it was difficult. There was no plumbing, no running hot water, and no modern sanitation. Water had to be carried manually, and heating it required both time and fuel. People did wash regularly, especially their hands and faces. Linen undergarments were changed and cleaned. Wealthy households made efforts to maintain hygiene because appearance and discipline mattered deeply. But even with these efforts, complete cleanliness was impossible. Smells were a constant part of life. Kitchens, animals, waste, and human activity all contributed to the atmosphere. Chamber pots were emptied by servants. Privies and waste pits were often close to the house. In warm weather, odors intensified. In wet weather, mud and dirt were tracked inside. Herbs and rushes were sometimes spread across floors to improve the smell, but if not changed regularly, they could trap dirt and make conditions worse. Laundry was an endless task. Linen had to be boiled, beaten, dried, folded, and stored. Beds needed airing. Clothes had to be brushed and repaired. Floors were swept and surfaces scrubbed. The cleanliness of a great house depended entirely on the constant labor of servants fighting against the natural buildup of dirt and waste. The kitchens formed a world of their own, hot, loud, and demanding. This was one of the busiest areas in the entire mansion, especially when guests were present. Cooking for a large household required immense effort. Bread was baked daily. Meat was roasted over open fires. Pies were filled, sauces prepared, fish cleaned, and ale distributed. Spices, often imported and expensive, were used to signal wealth and status at the table. Kitchen staff worked under intense conditions, surrounded by heat, smoke, sharp tools, and constant pressure. If the Great Hall represented the visible elegance of hospitality, the kitchen was the engine that made it possible. Food itself clearly reflected social hierarchy. The owners and honored guests enjoyed a rich variety of dishes: beef, mutton, venison, game birds, fish, pastries, sweet delicacies, and imported wines. Meals were often designed to impress as much as to satisfy hunger. Banquets were displays of power, showing the wealth and reach of the household. Servants and lower-ranking members ate much simpler food. Their meals might include pottage, bread, cheese, broth, and leftovers from the upper table. While still better than what many poor laborers could afford, it was far from equal. Drink was also an essential part of daily life. Ale and beer were consumed by nearly everyone. These drinks were often weaker than modern versions and formed a regular part of daily nourishment. Brewing was an important household task, requiring time, skill, and resources. Wine, especially imported varieties, remained a marker of wealth and status. Meals were governed by strict rules. Seating arrangements, serving order, and behavior all reinforced hierarchy. Even the act of eating became a lesson in social position. Children raised in such households quickly learned that food was not just about nourishment. It was about discipline, obedience, and understanding one's place in society. Entertainment in a Tudor mansion offered moments of relief, but it too was shaped by status and display. Music, dancing, singing, hunting, hawking, card games, storytelling, and seasonal festivities filled the lives of the elite. Noble households often employed musicians, and performance was considered an essential part of refined life. Long galleries served multiple purposes. They were places for exercise during bad weather, for conversation, and for displaying family portraits and valuable possessions. Outside, the estate provided even more opportunities: gardens for walking, parks for hunting, fields for riding, and sometimes rivers for boating. Yet leisure was never equal. What appeared as enjoyment for the owners was often labor for servants. A hunting trip required preparation, horses, equipment, food, and cleanup. A feast demanded long hours in the kitchen. Even celebrations meant extra work before and after the visible joy. Guests were central to the life of the mansion. Their arrival could transform the entire household. Rooms had to be prepared, fresh linen laid out, fires lit, and additional food supplies secured. Hospitality was not optional. It was a measure of honor. To host well was to prove status. In some cases, the possibility of receiving the monarch or high-ranking nobles pushed families into enormous expense. Hosting such figures was both a privilege and a burden. Grandeur had to be displayed even if it strained the family's wealth. Despite its beauty, the Tudor mansion was a place of constant risk. Fire was one of the greatest dangers. Open hearths, candles, wooden structures, tapestries, and stored fuel made every room vulnerable. A single spark could destroy an entire house in hours. Illness was another ever-present threat. Tudor medicine had serious limitations. Wealth could provide better food, more care, and access to physicians, but it could not guarantee safety. Diseases such as plague, fevers, infections, and respiratory illnesses moved through both rich and poor households. A crowded mansion could actually increase the spread of illness. Servants moved constantly between rooms. Guests arrived and departed. Close living conditions made exposure unavoidable. Children were especially vulnerable. So were pregnant women. Even minor illnesses could become deadly without effective treatment. Smoke from fireplaces added another hidden danger. While fires provided warmth, years of exposure affected lungs and health. The Tudor mansion was not a clean, quiet, or perfectly controlled environment. It was filled with heat, noise, movement, and constant physical strain. Servants carried the heaviest burden of this world. Their labor was relentless and often invisible in the grand image of the house. They rose before everyone else and slept after all others had rested. They carried water, chopped wood, cleaned rooms, washed clothes, prepared food, maintained fires, and responded to commands at any hour. Their work created the comfort that others enjoyed. Service could offer stability, food, shelter, and position, but it also meant strict discipline and limited freedom. Some servants rose to positions of trust and authority, such as stewards or housekeepers, but most remained part of the unseen workforce. This is what makes the Tudor mansion so fascinating. It was a home, but also a theater of inequality. Every polished surface, every decorated room, every grand meal depended on hidden labor. The more impressive the house appeared, the more effort it required behind the scenes. Even the building itself demanded constant attention. Roofs leaked, wood warped, metal rusted, fabrics wore out, food spoiled, waste accumulated. Animals needed care. Supplies ran low. Maintaining the appearance of perfection required endless work. And yet, despite all these challenges, Tudor mansions remained symbols of success. They represented power, influence, and arrival in society. For those who lived in them, life offered advantages that most people could never experience. Better food, finer clothing, greater security, and stronger social connections. Compared to the lives of ordinary people who worked the land and struggled with scarcity, life in a mansion was still highly desirable. This contrast reveals the true nature of Tudor life. The mansion was uncomfortable by modern standards, but privileged by the standards of its time. It was not a fairy tale, nor was it a place of constant misery. It was something in between, a world of visible luxury built upon hidden effort. The people who lived there enjoyed status and display, but they were also bound by strict expectations of behavior, religion, hospitality, and reputation. For servants, it was a place of constant work. For owners, it was a place of both pride and responsibility. By the end of the Tudor era, domestic life in England began to change. Houses gradually became more specialized, more focused on privacy, and in some ways more comfortable. But the Tudor mansion remains one of the clearest windows into a society defined by order and hierarchy. Every room, from the Great Hall to the smallest chamber, reflected a system where status shaped daily life. You could see it in where people sat, what they wore, what they ate, where they slept, how they prayed, and who was expected to serve. Behind the elegant portraits of the era lies a far more physical reality. A mansion smelled of smoke, wax, cooked food, damp fabric, and human presence. It echoed with footsteps, voices, orders, and activity. It felt cold in winter, crowded during gatherings, and constantly alive with movement. Its beauty was real, but so were its hardships. In the end, life in a Tudor mansion comes down to one simple truth: grandeur was visible, labor was hidden, and it was that hidden labor that made the grandeur possible.